does the Mexican boxing system produce a higher percentage of top quality professional fighters than the standard boxing system, which is followed by most countries around the world? And if so, why don't more countries adopt the Mexican boxing system? Now, before I explain what I mean by the Mexican boxing system, I first want to say that in my view, Mexico as a boxing nation, as revered as it is, has actually been slightly overlooked historically. There isn't as much fanfare around Mexican fighters globally, this is my perception anyway, as there is around American fighters. And I think part of the reason for that is that most Mexican fighters are in the lower weight classes. And whether you think this is right or wrong, the lower weight classes tend to get less attention from the general public. Obviously, there are lots of hardcore boxing fans who love the lower weight classes. But if we're talking about the general public, they tend not to be as interested in the lower weight classes and more interested in higher weight classes. Let's say 154 and above, or even welterweight and above. So a lot of great Mexican fighters over the decades have flown under the radar and maybe haven't got the type of credit that they feel they deserve, or that hardcore boxing fans feel they deserve. I haven't tallied up the number of professional world champions that Mexico has produced, but I know it's a lot. Is it more than the United States? Maybe there are some boffins out there who might be able to answer that question. Whatever the case may be, Mexico has definitely been far more successful as a boxing nation than most other countries in the world in the pro ranks. And could that be down to their boxing system? Now, what do I mean by their boxing system? Well, the standard boxing system, which is followed in America, the UK, Eastern Europe, and so on, goes as follows. A young kid goes into an amateur gym, trains, starts having fights, starts being entered into tournaments. If he's successful in those tournaments, he moves into bigger tournaments, from local to regional to national tournaments. Then he's in international amateur tournaments, and he's fighting for his country. Maybe he goes to the world championships, the Olympics, etc., etc. And then eventually, let's say in his early 20s, maybe mid 20s, maybe late 20s, he decides to turn pro, by which point he's got hundreds of amateur fights under his belt. That's the standard system. It's where you have an amateur career, an extensive amateur career first, before turning over to the pro game. Now, there are some fighters in America, the UK, etc., that don't have many amateur fights or any amateur fights and enter the pro game. Lots of them, in fact. But the general consensus is that's not a sensible thing to do. You're better off learning your trade in the amateurs before switching to the professional code. But in Mexico, they've got a different system. They take a different approach. They have a different philosophy. In Mexico, amateur boxing is not a big deal. Lots of Mexican fighters have very few amateur fights or no amateur fights at all. And they turn pro extremely young. Some of them are like 15 years old. I think Canelo turned pro at 15. And they do all of their learning in the pro game. Now, part of the reason for this is because of what we call the Mexican style. Now, not all Mexicans fight this way, but many of them do. It's a pressure style. It's a style that is high volume. It's a style that requires toughness. You have to be willing to take a shot to land your own. This style isn't necessarily conducive to success in the amateur game, where it's more about point scoring and having what they call correct technique. Whereas with a lot of Mexican fighters and the Mexican style, there's a certain degree of unorthodoxy to it. A lot of Mexican fighters throw unorthodox punches. They're not always textbook correct. A lot of them load up with shots, and they do a lot of things that in traditional boxing, by the textbook, you're not supposed to do. Things that would be seen as incorrect. But evidently, this Mexican style is very successful in the pros. And the pros, of course, is where you make money. So in Mexico, they seem to have taken the philosophy that we need to groom our fighters from a young age to have a style that is conducive to success in professional boxing. What's the point in teaching them a style that's going to be successful in the amateurs? Because then when they turn over pro, they'll be ill-equipped. They'll have to basically reconfigure their style. They'll have to adapt. It won't necessarily be a smooth transition. So let's dispense with all that and groom them from day one to be professionals. Teach them a professional style from day one, a quote-unquote professional style. And so that's what they do. And so you look at, it's become a bit of a meme at the moment, a bit of a trope, right? British fighters who've got extensive amateur careers, dozens or sometimes hundreds of amateur fights under their belt. They might go in there with an unknown Mexican who had 3 amateur fights and they get torn to pieces. Right? Because some of these British fighters were not taught a style that was as conducive to professional boxing as the Mexican style is. The Mexican style, again, not all Mexicans fight this way. So I don't want to have the all police trying to accost me in the comment section. I'm not saying all Mexicans fight this way, but a disproportionately large number of them fight this way. And that style, not just the unorthodox punches, but it's an attritional style. Mexican fighters tend to need several rounds to break you down. And in the amateur code, they've only got 3. Whereas in the pros, they got up to 12. So as I say, they take them from very young age and they teach them this style as teenagers. And when they turn over pro, they move them very slowly. See, this is different to boxing in most other countries in the world. By the time a fighter's 15-0, 20-0, they're already looking at world titles in America, in the UK. Whereas in Mexico, because they have very few amateur fights, most of them, they're not looking at world titles a lot of the time until they're 30-0, 40-0 even. I mean, go and look at Canelo Alvarez's professional boxing record. Go look at who he was fighting. I know there was a couple decent fighters in there who were successful or would later on be successful at lower weight classes like Miguel Vasquez, but for the most part, Canelo was fighting pies after he turned pro at 15. They moved him very slow and got him to learn his craft in a professional ring. Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., similar situation. He ended up having over 100 professional fights. But in the early part of his career, he was knocking over bin men, road sweepers, because he had very few amateur fights. Again, turned pro as a teenager, so he had to learn his craft. All the learning that fighters in Britain and America do in the amateurs, Mexicans do that learning in the pros. So they've developed this system, and it's a very successful system. So, as I said at the start, should more countries around the world, coaches from other places be looking to adopt this Mexican boxing system? Training fighters, young kids from day one to be pros, to have a pro style rather than going the amateur route. Now, obviously, one of the issues with the Mexican system is when you skip having an amateur career, it's probably going to be more difficult to get a lucrative professional contract. That's one of the attractions of going the amateur route. If you can get to the very top, if you can win world championships, Olympic gold medal, you got your name up in lights. Now promoters from various different countries are scrambling to sign you, give you a big signing bonus. Whereas in Mexico, you really got to come up out the mud. That's why there are so many dangerous fighters in Mexico who are unknown, because they have this system, right? They're fighting professionally from when they're 15, 16 years old, a lot of them. You look at the guy, he's only 20, you think, let's say he's 10-2, his record. He can't be any good. Little do you know, he's been fighting grown men since he was 15. Little do you know, he's had more time to acclimatize to fighting a professional style against other professionals than you have. You're coming from an amateur system where it's all hit and move and point scoring. He's come from a system from day one where it's all about getting it in. But as I say, the drawback for the Mexican system is that it's more difficult for fighters to get exposure. But we're seeing a lot of uncertainty at the moment with regards to amateur boxing globally. There's a lot of talk of amateur boxing being removed from the Olympics. Perhaps that's happened. I haven't checked on the latest news. But if it did happen, I guess it would force people. It would force countries all over the world, boxers all over the world, to adopt that Mexican system by default. Now, there have always been certain people, definitely in the UK, certain trainers and managers who have expressed their admiration for the Mexican system. They think it's a better way of doing things. One of them is Tunde Ajayi. He's long said that fighters are moved too quickly in the pro game. They need to have more fights before they step up. Was there a conflict between him and Frank Warren with regards to how quickly they were moving Anthony Yarde? I don't know. But on many occasions, Tunde Ajayi has expressed this view that as a pro, you should be moved very slowly, like they do with fighters in Mexico. Get to 30 or 40-0 before you start challenging for world titles. Now, the fact that I mentioned Tunde Ajayi is probably going to turn a lot of you guys off this Mexican system right away. But that would be very foolish. Just because somebody who maybe you don't rate or you don't like thinks the Mexican system is a good idea doesn't mean it's a bad idea. Think about your favorite musician. Think about your favorite sportsman. There will be people who rate that sportsman highly and rate that musician highly just as you do, who you don't like, who you would consider idiots. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Look at the results of the Mexican system. They have produced an enormous number of world champions over the decades. They've got this reputation of being very tough, hard punchers, great engines, etc. And this has been cultivated through their system, which is different to what exists in the UK, the US, and most other boxing nations. So let me know what you guys think about it in the comment section below. Would some fighters in some countries be better off if they dispensed with amateur boxing and molded young teenagers for the professional game from day one? Let me know what you think in the comment section below. And before I go, I want to give a shout out to all the new subscribers to my Patreon page. I cover loads of different topics in my weekly podcast, as you can see on screen right now, from current events to deep dives down the rabbit hole and everything in between. I'm really enjoying the feedback and the discussions we've been having on there lately. So if you'd like to join the conversation, just click the link in the description box below. Are you sick and tired of the mainstream mindset? Does the dogmatic conformity and pathological ignorance have you tearing your hair out in frustration? Then don't be alone. Come and join our brotherhood on Patreon. We stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. You'll gain access to my weekly topical podcast, where we take more deep dives than Jacques Cousteau on an endless variety of subjects. There's also videos, interviews, live Q&As, as well as a vast back catalogue of previous episodes, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen via the Patreon app or download in high-quality MP3. Connect with myself and hundreds of other members in our Element chat group. There's no contract, no commitment, you can cancel at any time, and it's cheaper than a Mickey D's McMuffin. Just head to my Patreon page via the link below this video and select the tier called the Brotherhood of Reason. I'll see you over there.